The morning Gromma Gorehorn walked out of the Ashwood with an arrow in her shoulder and blood on her boots. Micah Bailey's daughter was the only one who ran toward her instead of away. The frontier settlement of Caldervane sat at the edge of everything east of the great timber forests, west of the Graymere marshlands, and directly in the path of every hard wind that blew down from the Sunderback Mountains. It was not a beautiful place, not in the way poets wrote about. It was a place of split-rail fences and muddy cart tracks, of smoke rising from chimneys at 4 in the morning, of animals that needed tending regardless of whether your heart was broken or your back ached. It was a place for people who had run out of other options, or who had chosen deliberate distance from the world's crowded, opinionated centers. Micah Bailey was both kinds of person at once. He had come to Caldervane 3 years ago with his daughter Pell, a wagon full of tools, and a grief so new it still cut him clean through if he moved wrong. His wife Clara had died of the river fever 2 weeks before they were meant to leave the southern lowlands for good, and Micah had come north anyway because there was nothing left in the lowlands but the shape of everything he had lost. Pell had been 6 then. She was 9 now, with her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn jaw, and she had adapted to the frontier with a cheerfulness that sometimes cracked Micah open like a cold morning splitting green wood. It was Pell who saw Gromma first. They had been repairing the fence along the eastern pasture when the tree line shifted. Pell had stopped hammering and gone very still, and Micah had looked up from the post he was driving to follow her gaze. The figure that emerged from the Ashwood was large, taller than most men by a head and broader across the shoulders than 2, with gray-green skin that caught the early autumn light in a way that was almost mineral, almost like river stone. Her hair was dark and thick, pulled back from her face in a way that had come undone on one side, hanging loose across her jaw. She wore traveling leathers, good ones, Micah noticed, well stitched and dyed a deep brown, and she was carrying an arrow in her shoulder the way a person carries something they have decided to simply endure. She was not looking at them. She was walking with her head up and her spine straight, which took Micah a moment to understand was tremendous effort. She was watching the settlement ahead, reading it with careful green eyes that missed nothing, and her jaw was set in a line that said she expected the worst and had decided to walk toward it anyway. Pell dropped her hammer and ran. "Pell," Micah said sharply, but she was already halfway across the pasture, her boots kicking up the yellow grass, her dark braids flying behind her. He went after his daughter with his heart in his throat because this was the frontier, and he did not know this orc woman, and he did not know what had put that arrow in her shoulder, and every instinct he had as a father fired at once. But by the time he reached Pell, she had already planted herself directly in front of Gromma Gorehorn and put her small hands on her hips in the posture she used when she had decided something was simply the way things were. "You are bleeding," Pell announced. Gromma Gorehorn looked down at the child with an expression that shifted rapidly through several things: surprise, wariness, something that might have been a very controlled kind of pain, and then she said in a voice that was deep and even and very careful, "I am aware of that." "You should come inside," Pell said. "We have a table." Micah arrived at his daughter's shoulder, breathing harder than he liked. Up close, Gromma Gorehorn was even more striking, which was not the first thing he expected to notice, but his eyes were honest things that registered what they saw before his brain could intervene. She was perhaps 30, though orc ages were difficult to read if you hadn't been around many orcs, and Micah had not. Her face was angular and strong, with a heavy brow and the characteristic small tusks of her people, the lower ones slightly longer than the uppers, the way the northern clans carried them. Her green eyes were the color of deep river water, and they were looking at him now with an expression he couldn't quite read, measuring, guarded, and underneath all of that, a pain she had decided not to show but couldn't entirely hide. "Sir," she said to him, with a formality that told him she was accustomed to starting carefully with humans. "You need that arrow out," Micah said, because that was simply true and everything else could wait. "I am capable of removing it myself. "I don't doubt that," he said. "But it's seated deep and the angle is bad. You'll do more damage pulling on it wrong. Come inside. I was a field medic for 2 years in the Eastern campaigns. I've pulled worse than this." She looked at him the wary look at the extended hand searching it for the trick, for the fine print, for the thing that would cost her later. Micah held her gaze because he had nothing to hide and he knew how to wait. "You have a table," she finally said, repeating Pell's words with a faint quality in her voice he couldn't name. "We do," Pell confirmed, absolutely delighted with this development. Gromma Gorehorn followed them inside. The Bailey homestead was a solid thing. 2 years of hard building had produced a log cabin with a real stone chimney, a covered porch, a root cellar, and a barn that Micah was quietly proud of. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs, and the salt pork that had been simmering since morning, and Pell immediately began reorganizing the table with the aggressive helpfulness of a child who had decided she was very important to this situation. Micah put water on the fire and got his medical kit from the chest in the corner. It was a good kit, well maintained. He had been careful about that because out here, you were your own healer and your neighbor's healer and sometimes a stranger's healer too, and the frontier didn't forgive neglect. Gromma had sat down on the bench he'd indicated, which brought her closer to his eye level, and she was working at the lacings of her leather vest with steady, methodical hands. Her jaw was tight. The arrow had gone into the meat of her upper shoulder, just below the collar, and it had not gone cleanly. There was a slight cant to the shaft that told Micah it had deflected off something, possibly her pack strap, which had slowed it but also bent the path. "Can you tell me what happened?" he asked, pulling his stool close and examining the entry point without touching it yet. "Hunters," she said flatly. "From the Brackmore settlement. They saw me at the Graymere crossing and decided I was sport." Micah went still for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "That's not going to be a problem you have here." She looked at him, that measuring look again, and this time it had something new in it. "I am not asking for your protection," she said. "I know you're not," he said. "I'm just telling you how things are in Caldervane. We don't hunt people." He paused. "Hold still. This is going to hurt." "I know what arrows feel like," she said, and the way she said it was so matter-of-fact and so quietly devastating that Pell, sitting cross-legged on the floor nearby with her chin in her hands, made a small sad sound. Micah worked cleanly and as quickly as care allowed. He had told the truth about his field medic experience. He had served 2 years in the Eastern border campaigns when he was 19 and 20, before he came home and married Clara, and decided that was enough of that. He knew how to cut small, how to angle, how to seat his weight so the pull came clean. Gromma bore it without a sound, which impressed him more than he expected, because he had seen grown soldiers make considerably more noise over less. When it was done and the wound cleaned and packed with the yarrow and honey he kept for exactly this purpose, he bound it in clean linen and sat back. "It will be sore for a week," he said. "Don't use that arm for lifting anything heavier than a cup for 3 days if you can help it." "I cannot help it," she said. "Try anyway." She looked at him again. He was starting to understand that when she looked at him that particular way, full, level studying, she was deciding something. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. "Because you needed help and you were here," he said. "That's the whole of it." Pell made an approving noise from the floor. Gromma Gorehorn stayed for supper. It was not planned. Micah had not said anything to make it happen. It simply unfolded the way things unfold when a child is involved, and that child has decided the outcome in advance. Pell served the salt pork and the autumn squash and the hard bread as though Gromma had always been at their table, asking questions with the uninhibited thoroughness of 9-year-olds everywhere. Where did she come from? What was it like in the Ashwood? Did orcs really sleep with their eyes open? She had heard this and wanted to know. What were the mountains like past the Sunderback Pass? Gromma answered each question with a patience that Micah watched with something growing quietly in his chest, something he hadn't felt the shape of in a long time. She was not talking down to Pell. She was answering her seriously, like a person deserving of serious answers, and Pell was leaning further and further across the table in her enthusiasm, until Micah had to put a hand on her shoulder to stop her from ending up in the salt pork. "I came from the Gorehorn clan," Gromma said, in answer to the question of origin. "We held territory in the Sunderback foothills for 3 generations. The clan broke apart 7 years ago." She said it simply, without reaching for sympathy, and Micah understood that there was a great deal compressed into that single sentence that she was not going to share at a stranger's table. "Where are you going?" Pell asked. Gromma paused. "I am not certain yet." "Oh," Pell said, as though this was both surprising and full of interesting possibilities. After supper, Micah walked Gromma to the door because that was the civil thing to do, and because he found he was not quite ready for the conversation to end, which was a feeling he examined privately and didn't know what to do with. "There's the old Vester cabin 3 miles north on the creek road," he said, in the doorway. "Nobody's used it in 2 seasons. It's solid. I put a new roof on it last year to stop the rot. You're welcome to use it while you rest that shoulder. If you're looking for work, Caldervane can use a strong pair of hands. The tannery, the mill. Harton at the general store is always looking for someone who knows trapping roots." She was looking at him in that full, measuring way again. The autumn evening was behind her, all gold and blue, and it did something unfair to the line of her jaw. "You are very free with your generosity toward a stranger," she said. "You don't seem like someone who would take advantage of it," he said. "And I've been wrong before about people, but less often than I've been right. You don't know anything about me. I know you walked out of a forest with an arrow in your shoulder and didn't ask a single person for help," he said. "I know you answered every one of my daughter's questions like she deserved the courtesy of a real answer. I know you didn't eat more than your share at supper even though you were hungry enough for it." He paused. "That tells me something." She was quiet for a long moment. The evening birds were starting up in the tree line. "The creek road north," she said finally. "Third fork after the old mill wheel. There's a red-painted stone at the path." She left without saying she would take his offer, and without saying she wouldn't, and Micah stood in his doorway watching the dusk swallow the path she had taken, and felt something move in him, quiet and patient, like the first creak of ice beginning to thaw. She was at the Vester cabin when he rode north 2 days later with a bundle of extra firewood and a crock of the rendered fat he used for the wounds in winter, which she hadn't had. She did not look surprised to see him. She had, he noticed, already repaired the broken shutter and restacked the woodpile with an efficiency that made his offering look minor. But she took the fat without argument, and she let him check the wound, which was clean and closing well. "You are checking on me," she said, not as an accusation but observationally. "I am," he agreed, "because you don't trust that I will recover. Because you were shot 2 days ago and living alone in an empty cabin and it's getting cold," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she moved back from the door to let him in, which he understood was significant. The Vester cabin was small, but she had made it hers quickly. There was a pack in the corner that was very organized. Tools hung in a specific order. A fire built in exactly the right way for maximum heat from minimum wood. She knew what she was doing in the wilderness. She had been living it for a while. "Can I ask how long you have been traveling?" he said, sitting on the chair she indicated, which was the only chair. "Since the clan broke," she said, which meant 7 years. He calculated that quickly. She had been roughly 23 when her clan fell apart, which meant she had spent nearly a decade alone or close to it. "That's a long time," he said. "It is the time it has been," she said, as though duration were a fact rather than an experience, and he understood that she had learned to hold it that way. "What broke the clan?" He asked because he thought she might not mind a direct question as much as she would mind a careful one. She was quiet for a moment, turning something over. "The old leaders died within 1 season of each other. There were 2 younger leaders who both believed the clan should follow them. The argument became a fracture. Families chose sides. The choosing tore what was left." She paused. "I chose neither side. There was no side worth the cost. And that made you an outsider to both." "It made me the kind of person neither side wanted reminded of them," she said. So I left. I have been moving since." Micah looked at her in the firelight and thought about the weight of 7 years of careful, deliberate movement, of never being somewhere long enough to be asked to stay, of learning to need very little because little was all there was. He thought about his own particular version of that, the years of grief that had made him want to narrow his life down to something he could manage, the way he had built his fences around Caldervane as much inside himself as on the land. "You can stay as long as you need," he said. "No condition to it." "You keep saying things like that," she said. "Because I keep meaning them," he said. She looked at him then the way she had looked at him a handful of times before, that full river water gaze, and this time he thought he understood it a little better. She was looking at him like she was trying to find the place where the generosity ended and the cost began, and was repeatedly failing to locate it, and that failure was its own kind of disorientation. "I will work," she said. "I will not be a charity." "I never thought you would be," he said. She did work. Within a week of settling in the Vester cabin, Gromma Gorehorn had made herself known in Caldervane in the way a capable person makes themselves known, not by announcement but by action. She went to the mill and spoke to old Davin Tusk, who was short-handed and not particularly interested in a person's species as long as that person could work. She could work. She could work harder and longer than any 2 men he had, and by the end of the first week she was carrying grain sacks and operating the grinding wheel with a quiet, steady competence that made Davin look at her less like a curiosity and more like a payroll line. Not everyone in Caldervane was Davin. The settlement was small, perhaps 70 souls in the immediate area, with another 30 or so on outlying farms within half a day's ride. And while it was not the hostile mob that some frontier places became, it was not uniformly comfortable either. There were looks in the market square. There were people who stepped to the other side of the path when Gromma walked it. There was one man, a trapper named Elso Rake, who made a comment at the general store that was loud enough to be heard 2 stalls down, about orc women and their kind. Micah had been at the counter when that happened. He had turned around slowly and looked at Elso Rake with a quietness that was colder than anger, and he had said, "You're going to want to not do that again, Elso." Elso had wanted to puff up and make something of it, but there was something in Micah's stillness that was not the stillness of a man who was uncertain about whether he would follow through. Elso had made a noise that might have been something and was mostly nothing, and left the store. Gromma, who had been at the far end of the counter, had said nothing until they were outside on the board walkway. Then she had said, "You didn't need to do that." "I know I didn't need to," Micah said. "I wanted to. I can handle Elso Rake's opinions." "I know you can," he said. "That's not why I said it." She looked at him. The frontier street was ordinary around them, a cart passing, chickens in the dust, the sound of the mill turning in the middle distance. The ordinary world doing its ordinary things while she looked at him like she was trying to solve something. "Then why?" she said, not quite a question. "Because it wasn't right," he said, and that was as complicated as he was willing to make it, because some things he believed were simply true without needing to be dressed up. Autumn deepened. The days grew short, and the cold came in hard from the mountains, and the work of winter preparation was the work of everyone in Caldervane, cutting and stacking, salting and cellaring, mending and preparing. Gromma Gorehorn proved herself useful in ways that extended her value beyond the mill. She knew the forest, knew it the way a person knows something they have lived in for years, and she began trading that knowledge in exchange for the small things she needed: dried goods, lamp oil, a better sleeping blanket than the one she had. She also began coming to the Bailey homestead. It started with Pell, because most things started with Pell. His daughter had decided that Gromma was her particular friend, with the single-mindedness of 9-year-olds who have attached themselves to an adult they find fascinating, and she had begun appearing at the Vester cabin on the days when Micah didn't explicitly tell her not to. Gromma, apparently, did not send her away. Instead, she began walking Pell back to the homestead in the evenings, and those walks became increasingly likely to end with Gromma inside the cabin for supper, and Micah increasingly aware that he was looking forward to those evenings in a way that had nothing to do with company in general and everything to do with her specifically. He noticed things about her that accumulated the way knowledge accumulates slowly, then all at once. He noticed that she laughed rarely, but when she did it was real, a deep, genuine sound that came from somewhere unguarded, and each time he heard it, he felt like he had been given something precious and slightly unexpected. He noticed that she listened with her whole body, that she turned herself toward the person speaking in a way that made you feel like what you said mattered. He noticed that she was careful with Pell in a way that was neither indulgent nor cold, but something in between, honest, warm, treating his daughter as someone worth the truth. He noticed that she was beautiful. He noticed it and then felt the complicated thing that follows noticing, the guilt and the longing and the sense of betrayal that was not actually betrayal, and then the other thing underneath all of that, which was the quiet recognition that he was still alive and Clara had been gone 3 years, and being still alive was supposed to mean something. The first conversation they had about Clara happened in early winter, on an evening when Pell had fallen asleep in front of the fire while Gromma was teaching her to braid rope orc style, which was tighter and more complex than the frontier way. Micah had put Pell to bed, and when he came back to the main room, Gromma was banking the fire, which she had started doing without being asked, simply because it was there to be done. Her mother, Gromma said, without turning from the fire. She does not talk about her. She was very young when Clara died, Micah said. She remembers her the way you remember a feeling more than a person, I think, the warmth of her, the sound of her voice. And you? Gromma said, straightening and turning. How do you remember her? Micah sat down in his chair and was quiet for a moment, considering the question honestly. Whole, he finally said. I remember her whole. The way she was impatient in the mornings before the first cup of tea. The way she could not abide dishonesty in small things but was very good at kindness in large ones. The way she smelled of rosemary because she put it in everything she cooked. He paused. It used to hurt to remember her like that. Now it mostly just feels like holding something I'm grateful to have held. Gromma was watching him. That is a good thing, she said quietly. It took a while to get there. Most good things do. He looked up at her and she was firelit and still, and there was something in the way she was looking at him that made him feel very precisely seen, which was an uncomfortable feeling and also somehow not uncomfortable at all. What about you? He asked. Is there someone you left behind when the clan scattered? A pause. There was someone, she said carefully. For a time. He chose a side in the breaking, and I could not follow him there, and then there was nothing to go back to. I'm sorry. I am not anymore, she said. Some things end at the right time even when they hurt. They sat with the fire between them and the winter wind working at the shutters, and the conversation ran on into the night without either of them remarking on how late it was getting. And it was only when the fire was very low that Gromma said she should go and Micah said yes, but walked her to the door and stood in it watching her go with the cold on his face and something warm in his chest that he thought, privately, might be the beginning of something he had not planned for. The Brackmore hunters came in the second week of deep winter. There were 3 of them, and they came to Caldervane looking for a good time and information about a gray-green orc woman they claimed had stolen their catch, which Micah was fairly certain was simply a reason they had invented for coming north. He heard about it from Harton at the general store, who was troubled in the way decent people are troubled by the presence of the indecent, and Micah went to find Gromma before the hunters did. She was at the mill. When he told her, she was quiet for a moment and her jaw tightened in the way it did when she was suppressing something that had strong feelings. I did not steal their catch, she said flatly. I know that, Micah said. I did not take anything from Brackmore. I passed through their territory on public ground and they decided I was a problem. I know that too, he said. I don't want you to have to deal with them alone. Come to the homestead until they move on. I am not going to hide from 3 men who have a grudge about my species, she said, and there was a steel in it that was not anger but was something just as hard. I know you're not, he said carefully. I'm not asking you to hide. I'm asking you to let me stand beside you while you don't, because I would like to be there, and because Caldervane has a way of handling things like this and those men don't know it yet." She looked at him. The mill was loud around them, the grinding wheel, the water, and underneath it all the particular silence that lived between them when something real was being said. "You are very determined," she said finally. "About certain things," he agreed. She came to the homestead. The Brackmore hunters arrived in Caldervane the following morning and made their way to the mill, then the store, then eventually to the Bailey property, because they had asked questions and someone had talked, which was the nature of small settlements. Micah met them at the gate with a composure that he had learned in the Eastern campaigns, the particular stillness of a man who is very clear about where his line is and has no interest in being drawn past it. The confrontation was shorter than it might have been. Micah was not alone. Old Davin from the mill had followed, and Harton from the store, and two of the outlying farmers who happened to have business in the direction of the Bailey homestead that morning, which was not entirely a coincidence. Caldervane was a small place and word moved fast, and people in small places, when they have decided they like someone, have a way of making that known without a great deal of organizing. The Brackmore hunters understood the arithmetic. They left before midday, with whatever pride they could salvage, and did not come back. Gromma had stood in the doorway of the cabin through the whole exchange, not hiding, not shrinking, simply watching. When the hunters' horses had gone, and the neighbors were dispersing with the quiet satisfaction of people who have handled a thing properly, she came down the porch steps and stood beside Micah, and was silent for a long moment. "You organized that," she said. "I mentioned to a few people that it might be a good morning to come by," he allowed. "You told them about me." "I told them there was a friend of mine who might have trouble coming and could use the sight of familiar faces. They made their own decisions." She was looking at him again in that full, particular way, and this time there was something in it that was softer than he had seen before, something that had moved past the measuring into a territory that did not have a name yet but felt significant. "Micah," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name without any other word attached to it, and the sound of it in her voice was a small earthquake in his chest. "Yes," he said. She did not say anything else. She did not need to. She just stood there beside him in the winter air, shoulder to shoulder, looking out at the ordinary street where the ordinary things were resuming their ordinary motion, and Micah understood that something had shifted. Winter passed the way winters pass on the frontier, slowly, then suddenly. The cold had a way of pressing people together, of making warmth a shared necessity rather than a social choice, and the Bailey homestead became, gradually, the place where Gromma Gorehorn spent her evenings as a matter of course rather than occasional circumstance. She and Micah would sit on opposite sides of the fire after Pell was asleep, and they talked in the way two people talk when they have been alone for a long time and have found someone worth talking to deeply, about everything, about the stories under the stories. She told him about her clan, about the way the Gorehorn territory had looked in high summer, the meadows full of the tall blue-stemmed grass that the Orc clans called spiritreach, about her grandmother who had been the best hunter in 3 generations, and had died in her bed at 104 years old with a dignity that the whole clan had tried to model. He told her about the Eastern campaigns, about the mud and the cold and the brief friendships that form in hard places, about the moment he had decided that the world's conflicts were too large and his particular life was too small, and he needed to stop spending one on the other. He told her about meeting Clara at a summer market in the lowlands, how she had been arguing with a merchant about the price of wool with such cheerful ferocity that he had stopped just to watch, and how when she had noticed him watching she had said, without any embarrassment at all, "If you have an opinion, come share it instead of lurking." He had, and then he had never really left. Gromma had laughed at that. A real laugh, the full one that came from somewhere unguarded, and Micah had felt it travel all the way through him. "She sounds like someone worth loving," Gromma said. She was, he said. She absolutely was. There was a pause, and he felt the weight of the next thing before he said it, the way you feel the weight of a stone before you decide to lift it. I have been thinking, he said carefully, that I might be capable of that again, of loving someone. The fire crackled. The winter wind moved against the shutters. Pell made a small sleeping sound from behind the curtain of the sleeping area. Gromma was very still. I do not say that as a thing you need to respond to, he said, because he did not want her to feel cornered, had never wanted that. I just wanted to be honest about where I am. I'm not the man I was at the edge of that Eastern campaign anymore, all closed up and convinced that survival was the same as living. Being here changed that. Pell changed that. He paused. You have changed that. Gromma turned to look at him, and the firelight was on her face. And she looked like something he did not have a word for, like something real and rare and here, at his fireside, in the middle of the frontier winter. You do not know what it costs, she said quietly, to hear someone say things like that and believe them. I think I have some idea, he said. 7 years, Micah. Her voice was low. 7 years of walking into places and watching people decide what I was before I opened my mouth. 7 years of being the problem or the spectacle or the thing people warned their children about. She paused, and he could see the care it took to say what was underneath that. And then you. You and your daughter with her hands on her hips. You and your table and your matter-of-fact offer of the cabin. You and your neighbors showing up on a winter morning because you asked them to. Gromma, he said. I want to believe it, she said. I'm trying to believe it. Take whatever time you need, he said. I will be here. She looked at him one more long moment. Then she said, I know, and it was the most significant 2 words he had heard in years. Spring came to Caldervane with its usual chaos, mud and new lambs and fences broken by the winter frost that needed repairing before anything else could be done. The planting season arrived on the heels of the thaw, and Micah was in his fields from morning to evening, and Gromma moved between the mill and the forest, and increasingly the Bailey homestead, with an ease that had stopped feeling like a visitor's ease and started feeling like something else. The day the question moved from what they felt to what they might do about it was an ordinary day in late spring warm. The apple trees in the south corner of the property coming into bloom. Pell in the far pasture with the neighbor's boy chasing something that might have been a rabbit and probably wasn't. Micah was on the roof of the barn where a winter crack had let in water, and Gromma was on the ground passing up shingles, and they were talking about nothing in particular, the mill, the summer trade routes, whether the east field should be put in oats or barley, and then there was a pause, and into the pause she said without preamble, I have been offered work south. In the Dunville settlement, a merchant caravan looking for a guide through the Gromma region. Micah set down the shingle he was about to nail. When? He said very carefully, the offer came this week, they leave at the end of the month. He was quiet for a moment. Below him on the ground, Gromma was looking up at him, and the distance between them, him on the roof, her on the earth, felt simultaneously like a metaphor and like a very solvable practical problem. Do you want to go? He asked. I don't know, she said. And then more quietly, I don't know what I am here. He climbed down from the roof. He climbed down because this was a conversation that needed to happen with no distance between them, and because he had decided in the moment she spoke that he was done with carefully not saying things. He landed on the ground and looked at her. She was 3 inches taller than him, and she was looking at him with that full searching gaze, and he thought that the worst thing he could do right now was not be clear. You are someone I want to be with, he said. That's what you are here. That is as plainly as I can say it, Gromma. I don't have any elegant language for it. I've been building up to being honest about it for months because I didn't want to push you towards something you weren't ready for. But if you're thinking about leaving, I need you to know that I don't want you to go. Not because of what you do at the mill or because of any practical reason. Because of you. Because when you are in my house, I feel like my house has stopped echoing. She was still looking at him. The apple blossoms were moving in the warm wind around them, and there were birds somewhere, and the ordinary world was doing its ordinary things. and she was looking at him and he was looking at her, and neither of them was pretending about anything. "Your house echoes," she said at last, very quietly. "It has for 3 years," he said. "Micah," she said, and then she said nothing else for a moment because she was doing something he had never seen her do before. She was getting close to losing control of something in her face, not to grief, but to something that was the opposite of grief, and he understood that was a very significant thing for a woman who had been holding herself together with iron hands for 7 years. "You do not have to decide anything right now," he said, because he meant it. "The offer will still be there when you've had time to think. I'm not going anywhere." "I know you are not going anywhere," she said, and there was almost a broken quality to it, like something trying to be steady and also deeply moved at the same time. "That is the thing. You are just here. You are always just here." "Is that all right?" he asked. She reached out and put her hand against the side of his face, and it was large and warm and very careful, and she looked at him like a question he hadn't known he'd been waiting to answer, and he put his hand over hers and held it there. "Yes," she said, "it is very all right." He kissed her in the apple orchard with the blossoms coming down around them and the frontier wide and open on every side, and it was not a small thing. It was the kind of thing that rearranges the furniture of a life so thoroughly that you realize later how much of the arrangement had been wrong before. She did not take the caravan job. She sent word to Dunville that she was unavailable. She told Micah this simply, without fanfare, and he received it the same way, simply, with a gratitude that was too large for the moment, and so he let it be quiet. They did not rush. That was perhaps the thing that defined what they built together, the deliberateness of it, the care with which they moved toward each other. The frontier did not stop for romance any more than it stopped for grief, and there were animals to feed and fields to tend and fences to mend, and the basic business of survival to be managed with the same daily attention it always required. But inside all of that, within the texture of those ordinary days, something was being made. Gromma began sleeping at the homestead on the nights when the walk back to the Vester cabin was longer than the evening warranted, which became most nights, which eventually became every night. Pell was so deeply satisfied by this development that she expressed it by being very casual about it, which Micah recognized as the 9-year-old's version of magnanimity. The morning Pell sat down at breakfast and said, with the focused intention of someone who had been thinking about this for a while, "Gromma, I want you to stay here forever," was a Tuesday morning in early summer, the kind of morning where the light came through the east window like something good. Micah had been at the stove. He had gone very still. Gromma had looked at Pell for a long moment with an expression he couldn't see from where he was standing, and then she had looked at him, and the look she gave him was the question. The full river water gaze with everything underneath it laid bare, the whole 7 years of it, the wariness and the longing and the hope that had been living under the hope like a seed under winter frost. She was looking at him like a question he hadn't known he'd been waiting to answer. He turned from the stove and he looked back at her and he said, "Yes, stay." One word. He meant 1,000 things by it and she understood all of them. Pell immediately started talking about where they would put her things, with the practicality of a child who has secured a desired outcome and is now focused on logistics. And Gromma looked at Micah with her eyes bright in a way he hadn't seen before, with something that might have been tears if she had been someone who let tears happen. And he crossed the kitchen and took her hand under the table where Pell couldn't see, and held it. The second half of that year was the most alive Micah Bailey had felt since before the Eastern campaigns, before Clara's death, perhaps since before he'd understood enough about the world to be cautious about it. Something in him had been waiting to be called back to itself, and Gromma Gorehorn called it. She moved her things from the Vester cabin in 2 trips and a cart borrowed from Harton's store, and she did it without ceremony, which was like her. She hung her own tools on the wall of the barn next to his with a practicality that moved him irrationally. She claimed the east window of the bedroom for her seeds and herbs, arranging them in the particular Orc clan way, each plant in its specific relationship to the others, a system she explained to Pell, and Pell immediately adopted as her own expertise. The autumn harvest was the first full one they worked together, and it was one of the best Micah had seen on the Bailey land. Not because of luck, though the weather had been kind, but because two people who both knew work could do more together than either could alone, and Gromma had a particular knowledge of the soil that was different from his but complementary, and together they put the cellar and the root store fuller than it had ever been. Caldervane was watching all of this. Communities always watch. There were still the people who stepped aside, still the occasional comment that Elso Rake or someone like him made when they thought they were among agreement, and Gromma bore it with the same steady containment she had always had, and Micah addressed it when he heard it and couldn't always address it when he didn't. But the community was also, gradually, doing the thing communities do when they have watched long enough, adjusting. Old Davin at the mill, who had liked Gromma from the beginning, became something like a friend. Harton's wife Tessa, who had been reserved and watchful at first, began leaving preserves at the homestead gate with notes in her careful hand that were increasingly friendly. The two outlying farmers who had come on the winter morning of the Brackmore hunters, both, were regular dinner guests by the following summer, and their wives came with them, and the evenings at the Bailey homestead became something that had a name in the settlement, a regular warmth that people referred to with affection. It was Tessa Harton who first called Gromma Micah's woman, in the context of a compliment rather than a label, at the autumn market, and the way she said it, easy, possessive in a neighborly way, the same tone she used for any couple in the settlement, was a small turning. Micah heard about it secondhand from Davin, who had been there, who reported it with a slight smirk and a commentary about time being a patient teacher. Micah told Gromma that evening, and she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "She is a good woman," with a simplicity that contained a great deal. He asked her to marry him in the way the frontier manages formal things, which is to say in an informal way that understood the weight of what was being proposed. He asked her on a November evening with the fire going and Pell asleep and the first real snow coming down outside, and he had been thinking about how to say it for weeks, and in the end simply sat down across from her and said, "I want to make this permanent, all of it, you and Pell and this house and this life. I want you to be my wife, and I want to be your husband, and I want us to be a family for the rest of our time." Gromma put down the rope she had been braiding and looked at him. The snow was making its soft sound against the windows. The fire was the only light. "Among my people," she said, "there is a binding ceremony. It involves the telling of your history aloud to the person you are joining with, all of it, the good and the hard, so that they know exactly who they are receiving. And the other person speaks their own history back. It takes a whole night. At the end, the bound couple is marked here." She touched her wrist. "And here." She touched the left side of her chest, above her heart. "With ochre and ash, the marks fade, but the knowing does not." "That sounds right," Micah said. "And then the human ceremony," she asked, "because we are also in Caldervane." "Harton keeps the settlement book," he said. "He can sign us if that matters." "It matters for Pell," she said. "It matters for her name and her standing here." "Then both," he said, "in whatever order you like." She looked at him with soft river water eyes in the firelight. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Micah Bailey." They told the story of their lives to each other all through a December night, taking turns, going deep, sparing nothing, and Micah learned things about Gromma Gorehorn that shifted the way he understood her. The years of the broken clan, the names of people she had loved and lost, the mountains in high summer, the loneliness that had been so total that she had sometimes gone entire weeks speaking to no one. And she learned the full shape of him in return, the campaigns, the grief. The deliberate narrowing that had been a kind of protection and also a kind of prison. By the morning they were something they had been becoming, but now it was whole. Harton signed the settlement book on a gray December afternoon with Tessa and Davin as witnesses, and Pell stood on a stool so she could see over the counter and watched with an expression of complete satisfaction. When it was done, she said, "Can I call you Mother?" to Gromma, and Gromma had said yes in a voice that was very careful and very certain, and that was that. The first years of their marriage were good years. Not easy years. The frontier did not do easy but good ones, filled with the kind of substance that looks like ordinary life from the outside and feels like something irreplaceable from the inside. They worked the homestead together. They expanded a larger chicken house, a second garden plot, a small beehive operation that had been Gromma's idea and became one of their steadiest sources of trade goods. Micah taught Pell to read from the 3 books they had. Gromma taught her to track and to know the forest and to braid rope, and to understand the Orc calendar of stars, which named constellations for ancestors rather than gods and told stories that Pell absorbed with reverent attention and relayed to her schoolmates with liberal embellishment. In the second year of their marriage, Gromma told Micah she was pregnant on a morning in early spring when the light was gold through the east window, and her seeds were just beginning to push their first pale shoots out of the soil. He looked at her for a long moment. She was watching him carefully, and he understood that she was measuring his reaction, not because she doubted him, but because this was the thing, the real and irreversible thing, the place where some people's goodwill ended, the place where the theory of loving across difference met the fact of it. He crossed to her in 3 steps and took her face in his hands and held it with a care that he hoped translated everything he felt, and he said, "We are going to need to figure out a larger sleeping area." She laughed. The real laugh, the full unguarded one. He kissed her. Pell, when told, went through approximately 45 seconds of very intense processing, and then announced that she had decided it would be a boy and his name should be Thorn, which was non-negotiable. The baby was born in late autumn, attended by Tessa Harton, who had learned midwifery from her own mother and had delivered half the babies in the settlement. He was large, as the children of Orc women tend to be, and he came into the world with a set of small, rounded tusks already present, the tiniest suggestion of them against his lower lip, and he had his mother's gray-green skin and his father's brown eyes and a head full of dark hair. And when Micah held him for the first time, he understood something about life that he had not been able to understand until that moment. That it was capable of continuing to surprise you with its fullness when you had thought the fullest parts were behind you. They named him Torvan. Pell was satisfied that this was close enough to Thorn to represent her original vision. Torvan Bailey Gorehorn grew up on the frontier with the particular confidence of a child who is completely certain he is loved, which is a rare and significant gift. He was big from the start, inheriting his mother's frame, and he had her way of watching people carefully before committing to them, combined with his father's steady unhurriedness. He was not half of 2 things. He was whole a frontier child, a homestead child, an Ashwood child and a Caldervane child, with a foot in every part of his inheritance. By the time Torvan was 3, Pell was 12 and had developed opinions about nearly everything and a particular talent for the forge that surprised them all. Davin's son had taken over the mill, and the settlement had recently gotten a smithy, and Pell had asked to apprentice there with a directness that was so purely her mother's that Micah had felt something sweet and sharp at the same time. The 3rd year of their marriage also brought the last serious challenge from outside, which came in the form of a new settlement elder named Corden, who had come from the south with his family, and a set of views about Orc people that were common enough in the lower settlements, and that he did not see any reason to soften. He made his opinions known through the ordinary channels of community influence, whose hand he shook, whose business he gave his trade, what he said at the settlement meetings. And for a period of several months there was a tension in Caldervane that had to be lived with carefully. Micah went to speak with Corden directly, on a February morning when the ground was iron-hard and the sky was the color of old pewter. And he stood in Corden's yard and spoke plainly about his family and about Caldervane, and about what kind of place he intended it to be. Not with anger, but with the absolute directness of a man who has decided exactly where the line is and has nothing to lose by saying so. He told Corden that his wife was Gromma Bailey Gorehorn, that she was a working member of this settlement and a decent person and a better neighbor than most, and that his son was a Caldervane child and would be treated accordingly, and that Micah was not interested in whether Corden found that comfortable. He was interested only in whether Corden could conduct himself with the basic civil decency that everyone in Caldervane extended to everyone else. Corden had listened with a stiff face. He was not an evil man, exactly. He was a man of his time and his place and his particular limitations, and Micah understood that you could not argue someone out of a position they had held their whole life with a single conversation in a frozen yard. But you could make the expectations clear, and you could make the consequences of ignoring them just as clear, and you could rely on the community you had spent 4 years building to back it up, which Caldervane did. Corden adjusted slowly, with a grudgingness that never fully resolved into warmth. He and Micah were never friendly, but he kept his opinions increasingly to himself, which was all Micah had actually required. Gromma, when Micah told her about the conversation, was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You did not need to fight my fights." "I know I didn't need to," he said, which was what he always said to this, and she knew it, and it meant the same thing each time. "I love you," she said, simply and directly, because that was how she said things that mattered. "I love you," he said the same way. Torvin turned 5 in the autumn of a particularly good harvest year, and Pell was 14 and working full days at the smithy, and coming home smelling of char and iron and happier than Micah had ever seen her. Gromma had expanded the beehive operation to 6 hives, and had begun teaching a small group of the settlement's women the Orkclan method of honey harvesting, which had a lower die-off rate than the standard frontier method, and had become a minor point of practical settlement pride. The homestead was full. Not just of people, the cat that Torvin had dragged home from the forest in the fall, and that Gromma had accepted with a pointed look at Micah that said this was his fault, the chickens who had increased their population with the summer, the half-wild dog that had attached itself to Pell 2 years ago, and was now fully integrated into the household by virtue of looking at everyone with devoted certainty. It was full in the way that means something that a single room can never be. That means the daily physical evidence of a life being lived together. On a particular evening in that 5th year, Micah sat on the porch steps with Torvin half asleep in his lap and watched the tree line darken at the edge of the Ashwood, and Gromma came out and sat beside him and leaned into him in the specific way she had, her shoulder against his, which was not leaning so much as alignment. 2 things settled comfortably into the same space. "Do you remember," he said quietly, "the morning I watched you come out of that tree line?" "I remember your daughter running at me," Gromma said. "I thought she was very small and very unafraid. She has always been very small and very unafraid. She gets that from her mother." Micah considered this. "I think so too," he said, "and her stubbornness from me, it is a formidable combination." Gromma made a sound that was almost a laugh. Torvin stirred, settled deeper into Micah's lap with the absolute deadweight comfort of a sleeping 5-year-old. "What did you think?" Micah asked. "When I offered you the cabin the first time, what did you really think?" "I thought you were either very good or very foolish," she said. "I could not determine which." "And now," she looked at him. The Ashwood was dark and the first stars were out and the porch light was warm behind them, and she looked at him with the green eyes that he had spent 5 years learning and was still learning and expected to spend a long time more on. "I think you were right," she said, "about what you said in the apple orchard, that you can be right about a person more often than wrong if you are paying attention." "I was paying attention," he said. "You were very obvious about it," she said, with a warmth that was teasing and tender at once. "I was hoping you would notice." She put her head against his shoulder, which she did sometimes in the evenings when it was just the 2 of them, quietly. He put his arm around her and she settled in, and they sat on the porch of the Bailey homestead in the frontier dark with their son asleep between them and their daughter's lamplight visible from the room she used for her smithy sketches. And the Ashwood was quiet, and the settlement was quiet, and all of the complicated, hard-won, patient, ordinary things that made a life were present and at rest. Torven made a small happy sound in his sleep that was absolutely orc in its low register and absolutely a child's in its innocence. And Micah pressed his lips against the top of his son's head, and then against Gromma's temple, because he was within reach of both and both deserved it. 3 years after that evening on the porch, Pell announced that she was apprenticing at a forge in the larger town of Myronville, 2 days' ride south, and that she was going regardless of what anyone thought about it, though she would prefer their support. They gave it. She left in early spring with a pack on her back and the forge master's recommendation in her pocket, and the kind of confidence that can only be built on the specific foundation of a childhood in which you were allowed to be exactly who you were. She wrote letters that arrived erratically with the post riders and were read aloud at the supper table to great commentary from Torven, who was 8 now, and had decided he was very interested in his sister's life as a source of good stories. Micah was 42 that spring and Gromma was 37, and neither of them felt the thinning of age yet. The frontier keeps people honest about their bodies, keeps them working, keeps the softness at a distance. But there were threads of silver in Micah's hair that had not been there 5 years ago, and Gromma's eyes, which had always been her most expressive thing, had a depth in them now that was the depth of lived experience accumulated and made comfortable. They were good years. The homestead was solid and known. The bees were thriving. The east field had been put in the orc grain that Gromma had sourced from a seed trader 2 seasons back, a tall amber-stalked grain with a hardier root system than anything native to the region, and it had come in magnificently, and Davin's son at the mill was grinding it into a flour that the settlement was now using preferentially. This was not nothing. This was Gromma Gorehorn's knowledge becoming part of Caldervane's bones, becoming the thing the settlement ate in winter, becoming something that would outlast any one person's opinion about where orc women belonged. In the summer of that year, a young orc woman came through Caldervane on the Eastern Trade Road, and Micah saw her from the gate of the homestead, the particular posture of someone traveling alone, carrying everything they needed, expecting nothing from the place they were passing through. He said, "Hey," and she startled and went still in the road. He said, "You look like you've come a long way. Come have something to eat." She looked at him the way the wary look at the extended hand, searching for the fine print. Gromma appeared in the doorway of the homestead, and when the young woman saw her, she went very still in a different way, the stillness of recognition, of seeing something unexpected and good. They fed the young woman supper, and she told them her name was Vesa, and her clan had dissolved in the southern territories, and she had been traveling for a year looking for somewhere to land. She was 22 and tired in a way that went deeper than distance. Gromma looked at her across the table with a look that Micah recognized, because it was the look of someone who remembered a thing very precisely and was looking at it again from the outside. "The mill takes on workers in the autumn," Gromma said. "There's a cabin on the creek road that sits empty." Vesa looked at her with an expression that moved through wariness and relief and something that might have been the beginning of trust. "I would need to work for what I take," she said. "I know," Gromma said. "That is not a problem." Torven, who had been very carefully eating his supper and observing everything, said, "We always have people," with the satisfaction of a child who has grown up in a place where this is simply true. Micah caught Gromma's eye across the table, and she looked at him, and in that look was every version of everything they had been from the first moment: the measuring and the wariness, the apple blossoms and the fire, the question and the answer, the life they had built from a single morning when a small girl ran toward a stranger in a field, and a man had climbed down from a barn roof, because some things need to be said without distance. "We always have people," Gromma said, still looking at Micah, with the deep, quiet warmth of someone who has learned to receive what they deserve and is grateful every day for having learned it. Pell came home for the autumn festival that year, and she brought a young woman from Myronville with her, a blacksmith's daughter named Wren who had her mother's steady hands and her own quiet opinions, and introduced her to Micah and Gromma with a directness that was so thoroughly Pell that Micah had to look away for a moment to compose himself. He was not sad. He was the opposite of sad. He was full, the way you are full when life keeps insisting on expanding past what you thought was its limit. Gromma put her arm around his waist in the doorway as they watched Pell show Wren the homestead with the particular pride of someone showing something they made, and she said quietly into his ear, "She is going to be fine." "She is already fine," Micah said. "She has been fine since she was 9 years old and ran at a stranger with her hands on her hips." Gromma laughed, the real one, the full one, the one that went all the way through her and through the room and through him. Torven, who was 9 himself that autumn and had his mother's frame and his father's eyes, and a character that was entirely his own, was at that moment attempting to show Wren the beehives with the authority of a child who believes himself an expert, and Wren was listening with a seriousness that was either genuine or very kind, and either way it was right. Vesa had stayed. She had taken the creek cabin and the mill work, and was slowly making herself part of Caldervane's texture the way all the genuine additions do, not by force, but by presence. She and Gromma had a friendship that did not require a great deal of words, the way friendships between people who have survived similar things often don't. They understood each other's silences. The settlement had grown in the years since Micah and Gromma had arrived. It was closer to 140 souls now, with a real smithy and a trading post and a school that had been organized by 4 of the settlement mothers and ran in Harton's barn on weekday mornings. Torven went to school and was learning his letters and his numbers with a methodical interest that reminded Micah of no one so much as Gromma. Old Harton himself was slower now, but Tessa was sharp as ever and had taken to Gromma's honey method as a personal project, and their beehives and the Bailey beehives together produced enough that they were sending it south with the seasonal trade caravans. The day Torven brought home a boy from school, a human boy named Fenn, with red hair and a gap where his front tooth used to be, and announced with the calm certainty of someone who has already made the decision that Fenn was his best friend, and could he please eat supper. Gromma said yes without looking up from the bread she was shaping, and Micah said yes while getting down an extra bowl, and Fenn ate supper and came back the following day and the day after that. And within a month was a fixture at the Bailey table in the way that certain people simply become fixtures when they fit. Fenn's family were newer arrivals from the lower towns, and his mother had not been sure what to make of the mixed household at first, and then Fenn had come home talking about Gromma's orc grain bread and Torven's tracking games, and the beehives and Micah's stories about the Eastern campaigns, with such enthusiasm that she had come to introduce herself with the slightly dazed expression of someone whose assumptions have been overtaken by the facts. She became a friend. It was not always simple, not always linear, but it was real, and it was one more thread in the fabric of what Caldervane was becoming. Micah turned 45 on a cold morning in February, which Pell remembered from Myronville and sent a letter about 2 weeks late, which was perfectly on time for the frontier postal system. Torven, who had been planning something with Vesa for a week, produced a carved box made from Ashwood timber that he had spent the month making in secret, and inside the box was a piece of blue spiritreach grass, dried and pressed, that Gromma had found in the foothills and kept because it reminded her of home, and that she had let Torven give to Micah because she thought it should be his now. He understood what it meant and held it like the precious and permanent thing it was. That evening, after Torven was asleep, Gromma sat on the edge of the bed and watched Micah put the grass carefully back in the box and set it on the shelf where the things that mattered most to him lived. The small portrait of Clara that Pell had commissioned from a traveling artist 2 years ago, the river stone from the Ashwood creek that Pell had given him their first summer in Caldervane, the marriage token from the Orc clan ceremony, the settlement record with heart and signature. "Are you happy?" she asked. He turned and looked at her. The question was real and direct, the way she asked everything that mattered. "Yes," he said, "completely. You do not miss the life you might have had." "The different one." "What different one?" he said genuinely. She looked at him for a moment and then she said, "I used to think happiness was something you negotiated with, something you could have pieces of if you gave up other pieces. And now I think it is a thing that arrives all at once if you let it," she said, "if you are not trying to be careful with it." He sat beside her on the edge of the bed and took her hand. Her hand was large and warm and known to him completely, and he held it in both of his. "You let it," he said. "Eventually," she said. "You were very patient while I figured out how." "I had somewhere to be," he said. "There was no rush." She leaned against him and he put his arm around her. And outside the winter was doing its winter things. And the homestead was settled and sound around them. And Torvin was sleeping deeply in the next room with the guileless sleep of a happy child. And Pell was in Myronville building her life with her steady hands and her formidable stubbornness. And Vessa was at the creek cabin being alive and on solid ground. And Caldervane was out there in the dark being what it was. A place where the hard work of belonging had been done slowly and deliberately and honestly. In the spring, when the thaw came and the apple trees came into bloom again, Gromma told him she was expecting again. He looked at her with the same attention he had brought to this moment the first time, and he saw her watching him with the same careful measuring, the same habit of checking, even now, even with all of this behind them, whether the goodness was real. He supposed that 7 years of being alone could build a habit in you that took more than 5 years of happiness to fully dismantle, and he did not hold it against her. He had his own versions of the same habit, his own tendency to check whether things were as good as they seemed, to make sure the ground was still solid under his feet. He put his hands on her face and held it the way he had done the first time. "I am going to have to build another room," he said. She laughed. "The real one." The second child was born in early autumn, a girl this time, smaller than Torvin had been but equally loud about being in the world, with her father's brown eyes already evident and her mother's green tinting beginning at the edges, a particular hazel that was her own color entirely. She had the barest hint of tusks, smaller than Torvin's, and she was the most certain thing Micah had ever held. They named her Clara, after the woman who had first taught Micah that love was worth the risk of loving, and Gromma had suggested it, unprompted, on the second morning after the birth when Micah was holding the baby in the east window light and couldn't speak around anything he was trying to say. "Clara," he said, finally, "just the name." "Yes," Gromma said, "Clara." Pell came home within the week, because Tessa Harton had ridden south herself to deliver the news. Tessa was 70 now, and had no business making that ride, but did it anyway with the authority of a woman who has decided her preferences outweigh the objections. And Pell arrived with Wren and a pack full of things from Myronville's market and stood in the doorway of the homestead and looked at her half-sister in Micah's arms with an expression that was her mother's. "She is very small," Pell said. "You were very small," Micah said. "I was never that small. You absolutely were." Pell sat beside Micah and looked at Clara for a long time, and then she looked at Gromma, who was resting in the bed, and she said very quietly, "Thank you for coming out of the Ashwood that morning." Gromma looked at her, river-water eyes full and direct and warm. "Thank you for running toward me," Gromma said. Torvin, who had been sitting on the floor with Fen and a set of carved wooden animals that were technically his sister's welcome gift, but which he had already decided were also interesting to him, looked up and said, "I was not born yet." "No," Gromma said, "but you would have." He considered this seriously and apparently found it sufficient. He went back to the animals. The years that followed were the full years, the ones that accumulate into a life. Caldervane grew and changed. A second wave of settlement families arrived from the South over the following decade, and some of them had the prejudices of the South, and some of them had been taught better, and some of them were people who could simply be shown, which was the majority of people if you were patient about it. The Bailey homestead was, by the time Clara was old enough to walk to the creek on her own, a known place in Caldervane, the homestead with the beehives and the Ashwood grain fields, and the orc woman who knew more about winter medicine than anyone else in the settlement, and who had pulled 3 children through the crouping sickness one bad winter, and whose husband had once told Elso Rake to reconsider his behavior in a way that Elso Rake had never entirely forgotten. They were known. They were part of the place. Their children were Caldervane children, Torven, who was tracking the Ashwood by the time he was 12 with a skill that even the experienced trappers acknowledged, and Clara, who had her father's stillness and her mother's patient observation, and who at 8 years old could identify 37 varieties of woodland plant by sight, a project she had undertaken with Gromma over 3 consecutive summers, with the focused intention of a person who takes a thing seriously. Pell came home when she could, less often as her life in Myronville became established and full, but the letters were regular, and the autumn festival brought her every year without exception. She had built something in Myronville, a forge of her own, eventually, with Wren managing the business side and Pell managing the fire, and they were good together in the way that people who make deliberate choices tend to be good. On a particular autumn festival evening, when Pell was 22 and home with Wren and Torven was 13 and Clara was 5, and Vessa had brought a bottle of the good plum spirits from the trading post, and Harton and Tessa were there, and Davin's son and his wife, and the family of Fenn who had become an uncle-adjacent fixture in Torven and Clara's world. Micah stood at the head of the table in the cabin that had grown 2 rooms since the year he'd arrived, and looked at the faces around it. Gromma was across from him, serving the autumn squash with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done this many times and done it with love each time, and she looked up and met his eyes, and in the look was everything: the morning at the fence and the apple blossoms and the December night, and the question on the kitchen morning, and the answer he had given and all of the days since, the ordinary and the extraordinary and the countless small moments that are the real substance of a life. He raised his cup. "To home," he said, which was all that was needed. Gromma raised hers. "To home," she said. Around the table, everyone raised their cups, and the fire was warm, and outside the frontier was dark and wide and honest, and inside the Bailey homestead it was everything the word home has ever meant when it means the most. Clara, who was 5 and had been waiting with some impatience for the ceremonial part to be over so she could ask for more bread, said, "To home," with her father's brown hazel eyes solemn and her mother's level voice, and clinked her cup of apple cider against Torvan's with the absolute authority of the youngest person in the room who has spent her whole short life watching how it is done. Micah looked at his wife across the table. Gromma Gorehorn looked back at him. He had not known, on the morning she walked out of the Ashwood, that she was going to change everything. He had not known that his daughter running across a yellow field with her hands on her hips was the moment his life turned back toward itself. He had not known that the question in Gromma's eyes was a question he had been waiting to answer without knowing he was waiting, without knowing the answer existed, without knowing that he was exactly the kind of man who would climb down from a barn roof in an apple orchard and say the true thing plainly and mean every word. He knew it now. He would know it every remaining day of his life, and that life was full and present and real, and the woman he loved was across the table from him, and his children were at his sides, and the frontier was wide and the years were good. That was the whole of it. That was enough. That was, in fact, more than enough. It was everything.